If you're over 60 and feel like your energy is unpredictable, some days steady, other days completely drained, this is not because your metabolism is broken. It's because after 60, your body no longer responds well to extremes. Strict low carb, strict fasting, or constant control can actually reduce energy instead of improving it. In this video, I'll show you why metabolic flexibility, not rigid keto, is what your body needs after 60, and how to burn fat and carbs without crashes, fatigue, or fear of losing control.
Why metabolism changes after 60, and why extremes stop working. After 60, metabolism does not decline because the body becomes weak or incapable. It changes because the rules of regulation shift. The same strategies that once produced results, hard fasting, extreme low carb, aggressive training, constant optimization, begin to create fatigue instead of progress. This is not failure, it is physiology adapting to a different stage of life. One of the most important changes with aging is increased cortisol sensitivity. Cortisol is a necessary hormone that helps mobilize energy, regulate blood sugar, and respond to stress. But as we age, tissues become more sensitive to cortisol's effects. That means the same stressors, poor sleep, hard training, long fasts, mental pressure, create a larger physiological response than they did at 30 or 40. This is why extremes stop working. What once felt stimulating now feels draining. What once increased focus now produces anxiety or fatigue. The body is not overreacting. It is responding appropriately to cumulative stress in a system that values preservation over maximal output. Another key shift after 60 is slower recovery, not a weaker metabolism. Metabolic capacity is often still there, but recovery signaling takes longer. The nervous system needs more reassurance that energy demands will be met safely. When recovery is incomplete, the body compensates by relying more heavily on stress hormones and quick fuel. This creates the illusion that metabolism is slowing, when in reality it is protecting itself from repeated strain. Aggressive strategies, long fasts, constant calorie restriction, daily high-intensity training ignore this reality. They stack stress faster than the system can resolve it. Over time, this leads to flatter energy, disrupted sleep, rising hunger urgency, and declining stress tolerance. Fat burning becomes harder not because fat adaptation stopped working, but because the body no longer feels safe maintaining it under constant pressure. This is where rigidity becomes especially costly with age. Rigidity removes flexibility, predictability, and recovery, three signals the nervous system relies on to feel secure. Tight eating windows, inflexible rules, and constant optimization force the body to stay alert. That alert state is incompatible with steady fat oxidation and stable energy. The result is fatigue, not progress. After 60, safety matters more than intensity. This does not mean avoiding effort or challenge. It means effort must be applied within a context of stability. Sleep must be reliable, fuel must feel sufficient, training must be recoverable, stress must be manageable. When these conditions are present, metabolism works remarkably well, even later in life. The mistake many people make is trying to push harder when results slow, but pushing harder amplifies the very signals that block progress. The solution is not more discipline, it is better alignment with how the aging nervous system regulates energy. Metabolism after 60 thrives on consistency over extremes, reassurance over restriction, and predictability over pressure. When the body feels safe, it does not resist fat burning, it allows it. Understanding this shift is the foundation for stable energy, resilience, and long-term metabolic health as you age.
What metabolic flexibility actually means. Metabolic flexibility is often misunderstood, especially after years of rigid diet messaging. Many people hear the term and assume it means eating carbohydrates freely, abandoning fat adaptation, or returning to the same patterns that caused energy crashes in the first place. That is not what metabolic flexibility means, particularly after 60. Metabolic flexibility is not about what you eat. It is about how your body responds to what you eat and to changing energy demands. A metabolically flexible system can shift smoothly between fuels, fat and glucose, without stress, panic, or instability. This ability becomes more important with age, not less. First, metabolic flexibility does not mean eating carbs freely or impulsively. It does not mean frequent sugar exposure, uncontrolled portions, or grazing throughout the day. Those patterns increase energy volatility and stress signaling. Flexibility is not the absence of structure, it is the absence of fear. Second, metabolic flexibility does not mean abandoning fat adaptation. Fat adaptation remains the foundation. It teaches the body that fat is a reliable, steady fuel. Without that foundation, flexibility becomes chaos. With it, flexibility becomes resilience. The body knows it can fall back on fat when needed, which is exactly what makes occasional glucose use safe. True metabolic flexibility means the body can switch fuels based on demand, not anxiety. During low-demand periods, rest, walking, light daily activity, fat remains the primary fuel. During higher demand moments, intense exercise, acute stress, cognitively demanding tasks, the body can access glucose temporarily without destabilizing the system. After the demand passes, it returns to fat-based efficiency naturally. This fuel switching happens quietly when the nervous system is calm. There is no dramatic spike, crash, or hunger panic. Energy feels stable before, during, and after. That is the hallmark of flexibility. The key difference is demand-based fueling versus fear-based fueling. Fear-based fueling is driven by perceived scarcity. Hunger feels urgent. Missed meals feel dangerous. Carbohydrates feel like a rescue rather than a tool. This state reflects low metabolic trust. Demand-based fueling reflects confidence. The body knows energy is available internally and externally. Fuel choices feel intentional rather than reactive. Carbohydrates, when used, serve a purpose and do not trigger a cascade of cravings or fatigue. After 60, this distinction matters even more. The nervous system becomes less tolerant of volatility and more sensitive to stress. A rigid fat-only strategy can become stressful if it prevents appropriate glucose access during higher demand. Conversely, unstructured carbohydrate intake can destabilize fat adaptation. Metabolic flexibility resolves this tension. It allows the body to use fat most of the time while still handling carbohydrates gracefully when needed, without crashes, inflammation, or loss of control. Importantly, metabolic flexibility is not built by constantly testing limits. It is built by maintaining a stable baseline and introducing flexibility gently, intentionally, and temporarily. The body must trust that fuel transitions are safe. When flexibility is present, energy becomes reliable. Hunger remains calm. Recovery improves. Mental clarity stays sharp. There is no sense of walking a tightrope between extremes. In simple terms, metabolic flexibility means this: your body no longer panics when conditions change. It adapts smoothly. That ability is not a shortcut. It is the long-term goal of metabolic health, especially after 60.
Why fat adaptation alone is not enough after 60. Fat adaptation is an essential foundation for metabolic health, especially after 60, but it is not the end point. Many people reach fat adaptation and assume the work is done. When energy plateaus or fatigue appears, they conclude that aging has slowed their metabolism. In reality, what often happens is that fat adaptation is being overextended without the regulatory support an older nervous system now requires. Fat adaptation teaches the body that fat is a reliable fuel. It reduces dependence on constant glucose intake, smooths blood sugar swings, and lowers energy volatility. This foundation is powerful and necessary. However, after 60, the body's priority shifts even more strongly toward energy preservation and stress avoidance. A strategy that relies on prolonged restriction, even if it once worked well, can begin to create the very stress signals that block progress. This is where over-restriction becomes a problem. Staying very low-carb, aggressively fasting, or maintaining long-term calorie deficits can raise stress hormones, particularly cortisol. Cortisol's job is to protect energy availability under perceived threat. In younger bodies, short-term cortisol spikes are often tolerated and resolved quickly. In older bodies, cortisol sensitivity is higher and recovery is slower. The same restrictive inputs now produce a stronger and more persistent stress response. As cortisol rises, the body becomes more defensive with energy. Fat burning is not shut off, but it is guarded. Hunger urgency increases. Sleep becomes lighter. Energy feels flat rather than steady. The body is not failing to burn fat, it is protecting itself from what it perceives as ongoing scarcity. This protective response is amplified with age because older bodies are biologically programmed to conserve resources more aggressively. Muscle recovery takes longer. Hormonal signals are more sensitive to disruption. The nervous system is less tolerant of repeated strain without reassurance. In this context, staying too strict for too long sends a message that energy demands are unpredictable and recovery is uncertain. The body responds by tightening control, not by releasing more fat. The cost of prolonged strictness is often subtle at first. Energy becomes brittle rather than resilient. Stress tolerance shrinks. Flexibility around food disappears. What once felt empowering begins to feel exhausting. Many people interpret this as a need to double down, lower carbs further, fast longer, train harder. Unfortunately, this escalates the stress signal and deepens the problem. After 60, fat adaptation must be supported by regulation, not enforced by discipline. This is where metabolic flexibility becomes critical. Flexibility does not mean abandoning fat adaptation. It means allowing the body to access glucose when appropriate without fear, while maintaining fat as the default fuel. It means eating enough to signal sufficiency, sleeping consistently, and training in a way that builds resilience rather than debt. Fat adaptation is the foundation, but long-term metabolic health after 60 depends on what is built on top of it. Without flexibility, recovery, and reassurance, fat adaptation becomes fragile. With them, it becomes sustainable. The goal is not to burn fat at all costs. The goal is to create an internal environment where fat burning is allowed to continue, calmly, efficiently, and without constant effort.
The 3 signs you're not metabolically flexible yet. Metabolic flexibility is not defined by how strict your diet is. It is revealed by how your body reacts when conditions change. When flexibility is lacking, even small deviations expose instability. These signals are especially important to recognize after 60 because the nervous system becomes less forgiving of volatility and more protective of energy. Energy crashes when meals change are one of the clearest indicators. In a flexible system, meal timing can vary slightly without consequences. Hunger may appear, but energy remains usable and recoverable. When flexibility is absent, small delays or skipped meals trigger sharp drops in energy, brain fog, irritability, or weakness. This reaction is not about calories, it is about fuel insecurity. The body does not trust that energy can be accessed internally, so it relies heavily on incoming food to maintain function. This leads directly to the second sign, fear of carbohydrates or food timing. When metabolism is rigid, carbs are not viewed as a tool, they're viewed as a threat or a rescue. Some people fear carbohydrates because they trigger crashes, cravings, or loss of control. Others fear missing meals because hunger feels urgent and destabilizing. Both reactions point to the same issue. Fuel switching feels unsafe. Instead of confidence, there is vigilance. Eating becomes defensive rather than responsive. Another major signal is needing stimulation to function, particularly caffeine. In a flexible system, energy emerges steadily from internal fuel access. In an inflexible system, energy often requires external stimulation. Coffee becomes necessary to start the day. Additional caffeine is needed to avoid afternoon crashes. Without it, motivation and clarity drop sharply. This reliance indicates that stress hormones are being used to compensate for unreliable fuel access. The body is not producing energy efficiently, it is being pushed into it. This pattern often culminates in the wired but tired state. Energy feels present, but it is brittle. The mind may feel alert, restless, or overactivated, while the body feels fatigued underneath. Sleep may be light or unrefreshing. Relaxation feels difficult. This is a hallmark of sympathetic dominance, where stress signaling keeps the system on even though true energy reserves are low. What ties all of these signs together is the absence of metabolic trust. The body does not believe it can meet energy demands without constant input, stimulation, or control. As a result, it stays alert, reactive, and inefficient. Importantly, these signs are not failures, they are feedback. They indicate that metabolic adaptation may be present, but flexibility has not yet been layered on. The system has learned to use fat under controlled conditions, but not to switch fuels calmly when demand changes. True metabolic flexibility removes fear. Meals can move without crashes. Carbohydrates can be used intentionally without chaos. Energy does not depend on caffeine. Calm replaces urgency. Recognizing these signs is the first step, not towards more restriction, but towards restoring confidence in the system. When flexibility develops, these patterns resolve quietly, often before any dramatic changes in weight or performance appear. Metabolic flexibility is not about doing more, it is about removing the fear that keeps the system guarded. How to build metabolic flexibility safely after 60. After 60, building metabolic flexibility is not about pushing the body to tolerate more stress. It is about teaching the body that change itself is safe. The goal is not to challenge metabolism, but to reassure it. This distinction is critical because aging shifts how the nervous system interprets effort, restriction, and variability. The first principle is stability before variety. Metabolic flexibility cannot be built on an unstable foundation. Before the body can switch fuels calmly, it must first trust that energy is reliably available. That trust is established through consistent sleep timing, predictable meals, manageable stress, and recoverable movement. Without this baseline, introducing variety, whether through fasting, dietary changes, or carbohydrate exposure, feels threatening rather than adaptive. Stability is not boring, it is the platform that makes flexibility possible. The second principle is calm fueling over forced fasting. After 60, aggressive fasting often backfires because it amplifies stress signaling faster than the body can resolve it. Forced fasting teaches the nervous system that energy availability is uncertain. Calm fueling does the opposite. It reinforces the belief that energy arrives reliably and without urgency. When meals are adequate, predictable, and responsive to hunger, the body stops guarding energy. Only then does it become capable of switching fuels without panic. Flexibility emerges from security, not deprivation. The third principle is recognizing sleep timing as the master switch. Sleep is not just recovery, it is instruction. Consistent sleep and wake times anchor circadian rhythm, regulate cortisol, and tell the nervous system when to expect rest. After 60, even small disruptions in sleep timing can destabilize energy regulation. When sleep timing is protected, metabolic signals align naturally. Fuel switching becomes smoother not because of dietary manipulation, but because the nervous system is no longer compensating for uncertainty. Without stable sleep timing, no amount of nutritional precision creates true flexibility. The final principle is gentle carbohydrate exposure after fat trust is built. Carbohydrates should not be reintroduced to test willpower or prove tolerance. They should be introduced only after the body clearly trusts fat as a reliable baseline fuel. When that trust exists, small, intentional carbohydrate exposure does not trigger chaos. It becomes demand-based rather than fear-based. The body learns that glucose can be used temporarily and released without losing control. This is flexibility, not constant carb intake, but calm access when appropriate. What ties all of these principles together is reassurance. After 60, the metabolism responds best when it feels supported rather than challenged. Flexibility is not earned through toughness, it is unlocked through trust. When stability is protected, fueling is calm, sleep is predictable, and variation is introduced gently, the body relearns how to adapt without stress. That is metabolic flexibility done safely and sustainably later in life.
What not to do? Critical for seniors. After 60, protecting metabolic health is often less about what you add and more about what you stop doing. Many setbacks happen not because the body is incapable, but because well-meaning strategies unintentionally recreate stress conditions that metabolism can no longer tolerate as easily. Understanding what not to do is critical for preserving fat adaptation and building metabolic flexibility safely. Do not test your metabolism aggressively. A common mistake is treating metabolism like something that must be challenged to prove it is working. Long fasts, extreme low-carb stretches, sudden carb loads, or intense training blocks used as tests. After 60, the nervous system interprets these tests as threats rather than experiments. Instead of adapting positively, the body often responds defensively by elevating stress hormones and reverting to emergency fuel strategies. Metabolism does not improve through repeated stress tests. It improves when it feels safe enough to adapt. Do not reintroduce carbohydrates under stress. Carbohydrates themselves are not the problem. Context is. Reintroducing carbs while sleep is poor, stress is high, or recovery is lacking almost guarantees negative outcomes, crashes, cravings, inflammation, or loss of control. In that state, glucose is processed through a stress hormone lens rather than a regulated one. This reinforces fear around carbs and undermines metabolic trust. Carbohydrates should only be layered in when the system is calm, rested, and stable. Do not stack fasting, training, and restriction. Each of these can be useful individually in the right context. Together, especially after 60, they often overwhelm recovery capacity. Fasting plus hard training plus calorie restriction sends a single loud message: scarcity. The body responds by conserving energy, increasing cortisol, flattening thyroid signaling, and reducing fat oxidation. What looks like discipline on paper feels like threat to the nervous system. Stacking stressors is one of the fastest ways to lose adaptation. Understand why crashes are feedback, not failure. Energy crashes, cravings, poor sleep, or rising fatigue are not signs of weakness or lack of willpower. They are communication. They tell you the system feels overloaded or unsafe.
Ignoring that feedback and pushing harder only amplifies the problem. Responding with reassurance, more sleep, simpler routines, calmer fueling is what restores stability. After 60, metabolism thrives on protection, not pressure. The goal is not to prove resilience, but to preserve it. When you stop testing, stacking, and stressing the system, it often recovers faster and works better than expected.
What success looks like after 60. After 60, metabolic success often looks very different from what most people expect, and that mismatch is why many overlook it. Success is no longer defined by dramatic surges of energy, aggressive fat loss, or the feeling of constantly being on. Instead, it shows up as stability. And paradoxically, that stability can feel boring at first. That boredom is not a problem. It is one of the clearest signs that metabolism is working correctly. Energy feels boring, and that's a good thing. When metabolism is regulated, energy no longer arrives in spikes that need to be chased or protected. There is no rush in the morning followed by a crash in the afternoon. No reliance on caffeine to feel functional. Energy becomes steady, usable, and predictable. You wake up able to engage with the day, and you stay capable without constant stimulation. This can feel underwhelming if you are used to adrenaline-driven energy, but it reflects a nervous system that no longer needs to compensate for instability. Hunger becomes predictable, not urgent. Success after 60 means hunger behaves like information, not an alarm. It arrives gradually, at reasonable intervals, and can be responded to calmly. Missing a meal or eating slightly later does not trigger anxiety, irritability, or weakness. Hunger no longer hijacks attention or decision-making. This predictability signals that the body trusts its internal energy reserves and does not perceive immediate scarcity. Carbohydrates no longer cause panic or crashes. In a successful metabolic state, carbohydrates are neutral. They are neither feared nor overused. Small or intentional carbohydrate intake does not trigger rapid fatigue, cravings, or loss of control. Nor does it require compensation or guilt. The body processes glucose smoothly and returns to fat-based fuel use without drama. This calm response indicates true metabolic flexibility, not tolerance built through force, but confidence built through stability. Fat burning remains accessible without force. Perhaps the most important marker of success is that fat burning no longer requires constant effort. There is no need to micromanage timing, restrict aggressively, or push through exhaustion to stay adapted. Fat remains an available fuel because the nervous system feels safe relying on it. The body is not guarding energy, it is using it appropriately. Taken together, these signs reflect a metabolism that is no longer reactive. Energy is reliable, hunger is calm, food choices are flexible, stress tolerance is higher. Nothing needs to be constantly fixed or optimized. After 60, success is not intensity, it is durability. When metabolism reaches this state, progress no longer feels fragile. It holds because the conditions that support it are consistently present, and that quiet stability is the strongest indicator of long-term metabolic health.
Metabolic flexibility is often misunderstood as freedom, the freedom to eat anything, anytime, without consequence. Especially after 60, that framing is misleading and counterproductive. Metabolic flexibility is not about overeating or abandoning structure. It is about resilience. It is the ability to adapt to changing demands without crashes, fear, or loss of control. A resilient metabolism responds appropriately instead of overreacting. After 60, the goal is not metabolic excitement. It is durable energy, energy that shows up reliably, energy that does not depend on constant stimulation, strict rules, or perfect conditions.
Durable energy allows you to engage with life, recover from stress, and maintain fat adaptation without micromanagement. It supports strength, clarity, and independence over time. This is a fundamentally different goal than chasing peaks or short-term results. True metabolic flexibility allows fat adaptation to remain the foundation while giving the body room to respond intelligently when demands change. It means fat burning stays accessible without force, hunger stays calm, stress tolerance stays intact, and when carbohydrates are used, they are handled smoothly without triggering chaos or regression. That is not indulgence, that is competence. This distinction matters because many people lose fat adaptation not by eating carbs, but by introducing them in a way that overwhelms an already stressed system. Flexibility without stability is not flexibility, it is volatility. Stability is what makes flexibility safe. In the next video, we will focus on one of the most common sticking points after 60, how to reintroduce carbohydrates without losing fat adaptation. You'll learn when the body is ready, how to do it gently, and how to avoid the mistakes that trigger crashes, cravings, or metabolic backsliding. This is not about testing limits, it is about expanding capacity without breaking trust. If your goal is long-term energy, resilience, and metabolic confidence, not short-term extremes, the next video will give you the missing piece.